Cameron Dill, the Director of the League of Cities and Towns. And we appreciate the leadership that you are all showing on a local level as we tackle this unprecedented challenge. In a moment, I'm going to turn the time over to John Park. John is a retired city manager who's now a consultant with the League and has been helping us with our training, and he's been responsible for putting this together. What we hope to accomplish today is to give you a sense of what we know and what we don't know around the economy during COVID-19, and we have the brightest expert in the field, Julia Tennant, with us from the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. And then we have some of our in-house expertise with city managers and others. We also want to give you a snapshot of what to expect from both the CARES Act this week and its implementation federally and the special session. I just got off the phone call 5 minutes ago with legislators talking through several of the bills. So with that, John, I'll turn it over to you and we'll take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. As Cameron mentioned, we put this together to try to give some direction in helping you figure out your budgets. It's budget season, as we all know, and even though we don't know everything about what's going on, we're going to give you at least the best effort that we can of exactly where we are and what to expect, and maybe some ideas on how to budget, and we'll get to that a little later. So, I'm sorry, has Julia joined us yet?
Hi, John, I'm here.
Yay! Julia is the Director of Economic and Public Policy Research at the Kim Gardner Policy Institute. And she's here to join us and to give us at least the best information that we have to date on where we are in the economy. She's going to cover 3 or 4 different subjects. So I'll just turn the time over to you, Juliette, and let you kind of run with it.
All right, thank you, John and Cameron. It's actually a real pleasure to be with you today. I think I told John, probably you as well, Cameron, that I appreciate participating in forums like this because I share data, but often folks like you are actually on the ground, right? So as an economist, I'm tracking data. I'm constantly looking in my rearview mirror to understand what's happening. And I find that participating in these types of forums helps me to be better and me to understand better. So thank you for inviting me. I do appreciate that. I'm going to try to share a screen because an economist trying to just talk into a Zoom without charts and graphs is really scary. So let me see if I can get my screen up for you guys. Am I good?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, excellent. I'm actually not going to put it into slideshow mode just because I'm nervous that will send things into some sort of tailspin. So we'll just present like this. But again, thank you so much for having me. I do economic research at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. We're part of the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. I work with about 30 research analysts who are just top-notch experts in all things economics and demographics in Utah. So I'm going to share with you some of the data points that we're looking at as we're trying to track the situation. We've experienced what economists call an exogenous shock. This is some major random event that just completely wreaks havoc on the economy. The economic outlook after an exogenous shock it's incredibly hard to pin down. You know, any economist who tries to give you some sort of outlook or forecast with lots of certainty, don't trust them. Exogenous shocks are really hard to predict what happens afterwards. In this case, there's a lot of uncertainty around like the how, the where, the when of this outbreak, of this COVID-19 outbreak. Our economic outlook is only as good as what we know about the outbreak. Those two things are intertwined very, very much. We are getting better public health information every day. So that's kind of helping to inform the outlook. But, you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty, although I am feeling better and better about the fact that we are very, very likely closing in on hopefully the end of what we're calling the urgent phase. So if you're not familiar with it, a group of business leaders that are participating in what's called like the Economic Response Task Force, which is kind of housed under the COVID-19 task force that the governor's called together, released a plan called Utah Leads Together. The time just completely, everything melds together. So was it a couple of weeks ago that this plan was released? And you'll see a version 2.0 of this plan coming out quite soon. But in this Utah Leads Together plan, we worked with health experts to really kind of put the progression of the virus into 3 stages, and then that's informing where we believe the economy will be in 3 stages. So we're currently in what we call the urgent phase. That began middle of March, when basically we kind of tied it back to when the restaurant dining room closure order came. We anticipated at the time that urgent phase would last 8 to 12 weeks. And so that means, potentially through the end of May into June. I'm actually maybe feeling a little bit more optimistic about this. I would have told you last week that a very bearish projection would be that urgent phase ended in just a couple of weeks, and there would be a low probability of that. But I'm sorry, a very bullish, I should say. I'll tell you about the bearish in just a minute, a very bullish projection. But I'm actually feeling more and more optimistic about that. And like I said, we just have to track what's happening on the public health side to really understand that. A very bearish projection would be that that the social distancing measures that are underway are not effective. The random testing that is in plans can't happen. The virus mutates and gets worse all of a sudden. So that would be a very bearish outlook, would be that this urgent phase lasts through summer. I actually think there's a low probability with what I'm hearing there. After we're in this urgent health phase, we move into urgent health and economic phase, and I'll show you some data on this. Spread of the virus, but also very, very severe job losses, and we'll look at some data there. But after we okay, you're good. Okay, I'm muted. John, can you give me a thumbs up if you can? Okay, very good. John, thumbs up. Okay, very good. Thank you. After we move through that urgent phase, we'll be in the stabilization phase. And I think that you'll see in the stabilization phase, these social distancing measures can start to be relaxed. And that really means that the economy can kind of start to stabilize, and you'll see those job losses slow. You'll see the unemployment insurance claims start to slow. And then, that's going to last, at least in our current projection, 10 to 14 weeks. And then we move into the recovery phase. So this is kind of our current thinking on progression of the virus, and therefore progression of the economic outlook. I'm going to just run through a couple of data points. It's really hard to tell you why Utah is so well positioned when we really are in the midst of a very severe contraction. But I do want you to remember that Utah does have the most diverse economy in the nation. The Gardner Institute has developed this measurement called the Hoffman Index of Diversity, and I'd love to share the nerdy math with you if you're interested in it offline. But basically, the bottom line of this analysis shows that Utah's economy is the most diverse in the nation. And so what that means is that when we're in a growth mode, we're posting stronger growth because we have so many industries that are able to share in that growth. And when we are in a contraction mode, that contraction is actually somewhat mitigated. And so again, we're seeing severe effects. However, the impact in Utah is softer than in other places. So let me give you a data point on that. If you look at current unemployment insurance claims today, what I'm calling the COVID-19 unemployment insurance claims, basically people walking through or actually going online, signing up with the Department of Workforce Services, making it an initial claim for unemployment insurance, about 5%. So the number of claims relative to Utah's total employed labor force is about 5%. At the national level, it's about 9%. So you can see where we've had a little bit of less of an impact. However, some of that's going to be related to timing, and then also 5% of the employed population in Utah is quite large. It's not something that we've seen in really the history that we've tracked the data. Some places have been better positioned coming into this than others, and you all know your local economy so much better than I do, kind of sitting at the state level looking down into the economies. But when we're talking about statewide averages, that 5%, that means that there are places where it's worse and there are places where it's better. Every regional economy is quite unique, and we'll talk a little bit about this hopefully over the course of the call. But as you're trying to project your budget, you need to be thinking about what your economy looks like, tying back to some of the risk factors that we'll take a look at. But this is older data, but you can see that those places in gray are better positioned, right, coming into it, although the impacts have been severe. So let's talk about the sectors that are what we call high risk. This is a table that I presented to the Economic Response Task Force. And again, like I say, all of my timing just completely runs together. But about a month ago, we were looking at kind of what we would expect, which sectors we would expect to be hit the hardest. And we identified the leisure and hospitality sector. It doesn't take an economist to tell you that social distancing measures like this are going to impact the leisure and hospitality sector, but leisure and hospitality, the transportation sector, specifically like passenger transportation. So we know what's happened with the airlines and then some of the other passenger transportation sectors. Employment services, these are usually, we kind of call employment services normally the canary in the coal mine. So once you start to see some weakening or softening in employment services, that signals that there's greater stress in the economy to come. So that's actually always kind of a high risk sector as you're moving into some sort of economic downturn. And then finally, we've been anticipating that mining would be a high risk sector. This is, we were making this prediction based on what was happening with oil prices, commodity prices. I'm actually feeling a little bit better. And then that sector is just volatile anyway. I'm actually feeling a little bit better about the sector given some of the announcements around agreements that have come out over the past couple of days. But nevertheless, when I was about a month ago trying to predict high risk sectors that would be initially hit, kind of the direct impacts of COVID-19, social distancing, about 17% of all of Utah's jobs are in these sectors. Also, we want to make sure that we're watching out for construction, manufacturing, obviously wholesale and retail trade, private education, so preschools, daycares, obviously private schools that, we've seen this play out. These are other sectors of the economy that we've paid special attention to. And again, it doesn't take an economist to figure this stuff out. Intuitively, this makes sense, but this is something that we've been advising policymakers to keep an eye on as they're thinking about policy interventions to support the economy. These are the areas that are highest risk. These are the direct high risk areas. In addition to direct impacts, we have indirect impacts, right? So the indirect impacts come from just an economic contraction. The fact that the economy has been, even the national economy has essentially been on lockdown, means that, there's consumer sentiment is down, business investment is down. There's a lot of spending that's just staying on the sidelines, which just causes additional stress in the economy. And so we are definitely seeing that, maybe some glimmers of hope coming in. So let me show you some additional data. So sectors to pay attention to last month continues to be the same situation. We have initial, and the best indicator that I have, it's a timely indicator. We get weekly unemployment insurance claims with a week lag. So these are the data that very much tell us where the stress in the economy is. The employment data, kind of the total jobs data that we'd be tracking, comes in on a monthly basis with a bit of a lag. You all know your sales tax data, that comes in with a bit of a lag. And so these unemployment insurance claims are very, very helpful in trying to understand what the current impacts of the economy are, and then also make some projections for the future. So through April 3rd, the most recent data that we have available, on the left is the count of initial claims, the actual number of Utahns who have filed for unemployment insurance. About a little bit over 80,000 Utahns at this point have filed for unemployment insurance. You can see in red on the left that the sectors in terms of level, the count of people that have been especially concentrated in leisure and hospitality, education and healthcare, professional and business services. And so I would say this is actually some of the indirect type impact that's happening. And then retail and wholesale trade. And some of that's also, there's the direct impact of that, right? So, folks aren't able, like some retail and wholesale has actually been shut down. But then on the flip side of that, even for those activities that are still open and available, there's this consumer sentiment where people are just holding back on spending on consumption. So I look at these data through two lenses. I look at the total number, and you can see that those numbers are quite large, but then I also want to look at kind of the individual sector impact. And this is important as you're individually trying to understand your regional economy, because there's going to be a different mix in your region. And so if we look at initial claims as a percent of jobs at that industry, we get a better understanding of how concentrated the impacts are. And of course, leisure and hospitality, number one again. So you're seeing leisure and hospitality as the most impacted sector in both of those measures. Other services pops to the top. So in other services, that's where we have, I'm just thinking about, you can see my hair today, right? Like there are salon services, there are all of these basically consumer services are in the other services category. And you can see that 10% of all jobs in that category to date, right, over like 4 weeks, really it's like 3 weeks, have been impacted. And then education and healthcare services and professional and business services. Education and healthcare services. Education through, as I mentioned before, the daycares, the preschools, those types of private enterprise. But we are also seeing an impact in healthcare. And you think, well, healthcare, wouldn't you think that healthcare would be ramping up at this point in terms of economic stimulus and activity? Well, we know that elective surgeries have been shut down. Most medical procedures or medical visits that are not urgent have actually been pulled back, and so we are seeing that in the data. And that's especially concerning to me. Those are those higher paid jobs. So the leisure and hospitality jobs, just the mass, that the sheer numbers there, and then the fact that there are real people behind these numbers is concerning. But they're going to be lower wage jobs, okay? When we're talking about those education and healthcare services, particularly healthcare, and then looking into professional and business services, that's where we start to see some additional stress because of the larger incomes that are related to those numbers. So let me show you what's going on and I just pulled all these data points together for you today. So I'm going to say that they're preliminary, but hopefully those kind of inform your thinking, and then we'll finalize some of these numbers for you. But hot off the presses, we took a look at those initial unemployment insurance claims as a percent of the employed population. As I mentioned, this measure for the state of Utah, about the initial unemployment insurance claims are equivalent to about 5% of Utah's employed population. Nationally, they're equivalent to over 9% of the US employed population. But here we're taking a look at those numbers regionally. And unfortunately, I don't have these data for actual city level, but you know your economies quite well, and you know that these counties are quite connected. And so this gives you an idea of what's going on. But you can see that at Grand, Summit County, Garfield County, those places that have economies that are quite concentrated in leisure and hospitality have absolutely been impacted. So looking at Grand, I imagine that there's some folks on the call from that area, and we know how severe it's been there. So 17%, so the unemployment insurance initial UI claims are equivalent to 17% of the employed population. And I know I track, as an economist looking at the state level, I track jobs quite closely. Jobs are connected to income. I have a number of years under my belt working in the Legislative Fiscal Analyst's office and then working in the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. So thinking through state budgets, I've been quite focused on jobs and income data. They're the most readily available data, so that it helps you to understand what's happening in sectors, but then also just kind of the lens I'm looking at. Those are the data that are most informative on what's going to happen with potentially going to happen with income tax, and then indirectly through that spending. But because I knew that I was talking to you folks that are more concerned about local budgets, obviously, sales tax is what you need to be concerned about. And so I pulled the data for the fourth quarter taxable sales in what I call high impact sectors. And those high impact sectors are those sectors that we looked at here. I'm sorry, hopefully I won't make you motion sick by going back and forth a little bit, but when I'm looking at high impact sectors, basically those sectors in red, and this is, like I said, it's preliminary analysis, so the numbers might not be exactly right, but the magnitudes and directions are there. And here you can see kind of through the counties, those areas that on a sales tax basis, the taxable sales, the percent of taxable sales basically in those high impact sectors, and you can see the distribution. The impact touches every single place in Utah to some varying degree, but I just want to point out that I think it's Wasatch. I'm trying to see, my glasses aren't, no, working very well there, so Morgan. For the county or Paiute, there it is, it's down lower, 7.1% in Paiute. Basically, the lowest percentage of taxable sales in high impact sectors is 7%. That number is large. And it goes all the way up to almost, 50% in some of our places. And so as you're kind of thinking through your budgets, this hopefully helps to kind of inform you to understand the severity of the impacts. But then you go back to, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly how these things are going to play out, how quickly things will snap back. There's good, it's very reasonable to anticipate that as the outbreak starts to get under control, there will be some amount of pent-up demand for those high impact sectors. And so you could expect maybe a bit of a bounce when things are through. But in the meantime, these are the areas that I would be paying special attention to. And I don't know if we're going to do questions now or questions later, but I will just maybe wrap up my official remarks with telling you that the Gardner Institute, we're just trying to provide information. And so we'll make sure that these slides are posted there. But if you go to gardner.utah.edu/COVID-19, you can see all the research that my colleagues and I are pushing out for consumption. I would try to actually get online and navigate to the website to show you everything there, but I'm nervous that I'll mess something up, so I won't. Maybe you can go there kind of in your other screen. But we're posting on a weekly basis some key economic indicators that are helpful in understanding where we are in that economic cycle. The hard thing is weekly economic indicators. We're basically getting unemployment insurance claims, but at the national level, we have a couple of additional indicators that we're keeping an eye on. There's a decent amount of commentary there that will be updated frequently from myself, my colleagues, Pam Perlick, she's looking at this through the demographic lens. Jim Wood is looking at this through the housing, real estate, and construction lens. Laura Summers looking at this through the healthcare lens. Jennifer Lever through the tourism lens, but I'm sure I'm missing people, but please use us as a research, check out what we've posted thus far, and then also please see us as a resource for you. If you have specific questions, please reach out to us, and we'd be happy to try to help you figure out data points, or at least try to point you in the right direction. So I guess maybe wrapping it up, we don't completely have a handle on some exact path or economic outlook. I do think that those 3 phases, urgent, stabilization, recovery phase, are what we should plan to. They're the most probable situation. We do think that, as more and more public health information comes out, we think what's going to happen is that, we won't see another economic lockdown, but we do anticipate that there will be some amounts of resurgence of the virus, even as we move into the stabilization and recovery phase. And so we're anticipating the economic response will have to be, it won't be like this on-off switch that we've been pushed into, but we're anticipating that it will be a bit more like a dial, so up and down. So to the extent that your particular economy or budget situation is tied to certain industries, you need to kind of assess for your information or for your individual area if you're vulnerable to that dial as we see resurgence. I think that, some of the bright spots, perhaps, some of you have your sales tax base, very highly concentrated in grocery, you're going to be in a pretty good situation relative to those of you that have your sales tax base very much concentrated in leisure and hospitality or some of those consumer services that are taxable. So there's just, I guess it's just, there's a lot of variation in all of this. Hopefully I've given you maybe a bit of perspective, but you know, I'd be happy to answer questions at this point, or like I said, definitely offline, please feel free.
Juliet, let me just ask a couple questions and then we'll move on. And then I'm not sure we're going to have a lot of times for questions, but if they send them in, we'll continue to have these. And so bottom line of what you just said is at least as far as sales tax revenue goes, it's going to vary from city to city. Do we have any idea, just kind of overall, what we anticipate the sales tax revenue to drop?
I don't actually have a projection of that yet. If I do come upon one, I will share it with you. I know that some of you, I'm not sure if we have Salt Lake City on the line, but I know that some of you actually do have some projections around that. And I just think that it's so important, and this is why I just appreciate what the league's doing. It's so important in this time that we're sharing information, that we're sharing best practices, that we're sharing what we have. It might not be specifically relevant. So like I said, Salt Lake City's sales tax projection might not be specifically relevant to, I won't pick, you know, like a smaller city or town type of economy. However, I think just that information will help kind of inform how you're thinking about your projection. I'm sorry, I wish I had an answer for that, John.
Well, there's none of us have answers really to anything. We're all kind of projecting. Do we have any idea of what's happening to our gas tax?
Yeah, so I don't have actual data right now on that. We're working on getting data there. We do anticipate a sizable impact there, right? So if we kind of think through, I mentioned that transportation was one of the high risk areas. You're actually seeing, right, like passenger transportation has declined. We've seen it in the numbers. And we would anticipate that would roll into actual actual individual consumption of motor fuel. I've not seen numbers yet. I do know that some people are maybe taking advantage of the social distancing by maybe, which is not good, by maybe visiting other places throughout the state. And so potentially, you know, there's probably a little bit of an offsetting increase, like there's some segment there where there's increased travel, which we need to get that under control to actually get through this, to get the economy back into recovery. But overall, we are anticipating a decline there.
Okay, well, yeah, you're not saying that traffic is down in the 40% range or something.
Yeah. And then truck transportation too, right? Some of your large purchasers, that's been incredibly impacted.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you for your time, and we'll hear from you again, I'm sure.
Okay,
because
that's great.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Now, Cameron, we'll turn the time over to Cameron. He's going to kind of walk us through a couple things. We are going to probably have a special session this week. I don't know if that's definitive yet, and also cover what's going on with the CARES Act and things like that. So Cameron, if you'll just take a few minutes and do that.
Perfect. Wayne and I will tag team this quickly so that we can get to the other experts on the panel here. And thanks to Juliet for joining us. Juliet and I both serve on the Economic Recovery Task Force. Every day I'm asking for data that does not yet exist, but league staff has been trying to track down every data point we possibly can find that could help you as you go through your budget cycle. Part of our goal today is Juliet had some updated unemployment numbers and those updated sales tax numbers that we thought were useful to get in front of you as soon as possible. So thanks to Juliet for presenting. The special session will start on Thursday at 8 a.m. The legislature is calling themselves into special session, which means they can keep themselves open for up to 10 days, and that's what they intend to do. It'll be a rolling special session, which means they will be doing some business on Thursday and potentially some business on the subsequent days. And the House and Senate will not be meeting concurrently. They will be alternating in order to utilize the WebEx capacity that they have at the Capitol. There are a lot of moving pieces about the special session. There will be at least 10 policy bills and at least 5 budget bills, because the state, like you, is going to be revisiting their budget based on the impacts of COVID-19. We are still gathering information about those bills. Our board of directors met earlier today to talk through several concepts. We have heard lots of rumblings about bills. The focus of this conversation is around fiscal impacts. We've received a lot of questions about a potential sales tax holiday or another way for business owners to not remit sales tax to the state for a period of time, which would have a dramatic impact on local governments. At this point, the sales tax holiday concept is not on the special session call. It's being considered it could be considered, I should say, later this spring, but as of now, it is not on the agenda for this week. What is on the agenda, and Paul, you asked if they're considering any veto overrides. The answer is yes, but it's still to be determined, and I know which one you're asking about, and I'm going to stand by that to be determined answer because the negotiations are ongoing between the legislature and the governor over the vetoes. Let me quickly touch on the CARES Act, because you will hear that the legislature is taking action on the CARES Act this week. They are, but in a limited degree. The CARES Act, as a reminder, was the $2.2 trillion package that Congress passed a week and a half or so ago. That $2.2 trillion includes $1.25 billion with a B for the state of Utah, of which $562 million can be shared with local government. It can be shared with local government because the CARES Act contemplates sharing money with local government for necessary expenditures. That's the term, necessary expenditures that were unbudgeted related to COVID-19. Now, before somebody writes in the text box, what are necessary expenditures? The answer is nobody knows. We wrote a letter to the Treasury Department over a week ago that we've referenced in our regular emails to you, seeking guidance from the Treasury Department about the definition of necessary expenditures and urging them to be expansive and inclusive with that definition. The bill specifically states that it cannot be used for revenue replacement. So as you are contemplating the fact that you're going to see less in sales tax revenue or less in motor fuel tax revenue, you cannot seek CARES Act reimbursement money for those shortfalls. You will be able to seek CARES Act money to reimburse you for unbudgeted necessary expenditures, again, depending on the definition of necessary expenditures. The bill, even though the bill was 863 pages long, only had one page about this coronavirus relief fund. They defined local governments as units of 500,000 people or more, which means we do not have a city in the state that has 500,000 people, and we only have 2 counties that have 500,000 people. So right now, the only entities that are entitled to receive that $1.25 billion are the state of Utah, Salt Lake County, and Utah County. Now, we have been pushing the Treasury Department through the National League of Cities, and I am a board member of the National League of Cities. We've been pushing the Treasury Department to interpret the CARES Act and the intent of the CARES Act so that the money can be shared with all cities and all counties, even though there's a direct appropriation that will be made to Salt Lake County and to Utah County. We've had conversations with legislative leadership and the governor's office about our interpretation of the CARES Act, and thus far they agree that that $562 million should be shared with local governments of all sizes, not just with Salt Lake and Utah County. So Salt Lake and Utah counties will get a direct appropriation, and then what's left can be distributed between the state of Utah, counties, and cities. We had a conversation this morning with legislative leadership where they said we plan this week to, in the special session, enact a framework to accept CARES Act money because the state will receive it by April 24th. Once we accept the CARES Act money, we'll use a little of it to reimburse us for PPE that the state has purchased, but the rest of it is going to sit until we have time to sit down with cities and counties and figure out a process to accept reimbursement requests and distribute this money. we put together a survey that we've sent out, and we have put together recommendations for what your cities should be tracking immediately and going back to March 1st around COVID-19 related expenses that could potentially be eligible for CARES Act dollars if you've spent that money between March 1st and December 30th. With that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Wayne Bradshaw, who's been working on that survey to give you a little more detail there, and also give you an update on the potential fourth stimulus, which Congress is considering, which could include revenue for local governments for shortfalls in revenue. So Wayne, take it away.
Thanks, Cam. So in our April 3rd Friday Facts, we sent out a survey asking, and it's a three-part survey. The first section asks about the financial impacts to your communities from March 1st to December 30th, which is the time frame for the CARES Act. We're gathering that data so one, we can better understand those impacts and work with the legislature to come up with however they're going to distribute those funds. The second section is talking about your next budget fiscal year. We are trying to put together some best practices for how communities should put together your budgets, and so it has a couple questions about what you plan on doing or how you're going to handle those. So if you have not had a chance to fill out that survey, we're requesting that you do that now. Again, it's all the information is in April 3rd. There's a link in the chat box, and we can send it out again tonight in tonight's nightly email. There is a third section, the USU Extension. They had a few questions about the services they could provide, and so that third section will ask their questions as well. This data is also important for us to gather because there is a potential for forced stimulus that you might have heard discussion regarding. When I spoke to Senator Romney's office last week, there is a disagreement between the Senate and the House and the vehicle for doing that, which should be no surprise to anyone. But there is a bill in Congress right now, and it is HR 6467. And our executive board will be sending a letter to our delegation encouraging them to support some of the principles in that bill, which provides $250 billion for communities that have residents of less than 500,000. So we were not included in the CARES Act. This bill would put money towards those communities that did not get a direct appropriation. Now in that bill, it applies for your direct expenses and also for lost revenue, but whatever the final product is, we don't know, but we are encouraging our delegation to support direct appropriations to communities. So we'll look forward to your responses in our survey and answer any questions you have.
John, let me add one closing comment about the special session and the survey. It is critical that we get this information in Wayne's survey so that we can share it with members of Congress and state leaders. It is critical that you track your potential reimbursement amounts so that we can advocate on your behalf at the state for a proportionate share of CARES Act dollars. And it's vital that you stay tuned on what's coming in the special session above and beyond the fiscal impact pieces. We'll have action alerts going out once we get more language from them. It's Monday night, special session will start Thursday morning, and a lot can happen between now and then.
Yeah, once the special session starts, it'll move really fast. 10 days seems like a long time, but I'm sure there'll be times that the League Army needs to step up, get the information you need to make things happen. So thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Cameron. We've put together a great little panel here. We have Gary Hill, City Manager Bountiful, Quinn Bennion, City Manager Vernal, and Dean Lundell, Finance Director of Lehigh City. We're going to just walk through in the next 20, 25 minutes, walk through some of the kind of best practices. We've talked to several city managers, elected officials throughout the state, and I think we can at least help you think about your budget a little bit different as we go through for the next budget session cycle, I guess it is. Let's just start out. Dean, would you mind just kind of walking us through, reminding everybody quickly how the budget calendar looks like over the next couple months?
Sure thing. I'll just throw out a few dates and then mention a couple things that maybe Lehigh's looking at and how we're going to approach this. I appreciate Juliet's comments, just the fact that the biggest thing is no one really knows what's going to happen, and there's really no way to have any specific data right now. So our big target date coming up is the first council meeting in May. We need to have a tentative budget to our council. And that makes it really difficult, right? Because I know we have January sales tax data, which was fantastic. I think we'll get February sales tax data here in a couple of weeks, which will also probably look really good. March might fade off in some directions, although, like I said, a city like Lehigh, some of our biggest sales tax payers are Costco and a couple grocery stores. And I realize you have the whole state impact that's going to impact us, but it may not fade too much in March. I think obviously the second quarter of the year, April through June, are going to be somewhat devastating, but there's just no way to put a number to it yet. And one thing that we're trying to do in putting our budget together is try to make decisions based on some kind of data, not just fear and just the dread that's kind of overhanging everybody. So we have our tentative budget that's due here in a couple of weeks, and then we have to have our final budget adopted by June 22nd, which is still a few weeks away. But the problem is by June 22nd, we still won't even have March's sales tax numbers. So it's really difficult, if not impossible, to put a number to what the losses are. Like I said, we know the fourth quarter, or the second quarter of the calendar year, fourth quarter of the fiscal year for 2020 is going to be really bad. But property taxes, shouldn't have changed. Our property taxes were already in before this happened. I think most cities, probably, especially the last 3 or 4 months, sales tax receipts have really been good and are probably a bit ahead. So you have a little bit of a cushion there. I worry about next year, not just in sales tax, but in property tax as well. Just the fact that if you remember back about 10 years ago when we had the recession, I think collection percentage for property tax went from about 95%, which seems to be what it always is, down to more like 88%. For our city, that's a big hit. Well, for everybody, it's a big hit, but it's that'd be $700,000 for us. And so it's just, like I said, I think our biggest thing is to try to look at data before we're putting our budget together. I think we can get to the point where you can budget for ranges. In other words, you can budget for a more conservative range of lower revenues and budget for a higher range, or more of a normal range. And you can look at your budget and think of things that can be implemented incrementally. Like, for example, if you have pay increases budgeted for employees, those could be delayed a little bit. That would save money, as well as be able to have you put have some data behind your decision, even split it up into 2 portions. We've talked about doing that, as having maybe a small increase in July and then wait till later in the year before we move ahead with another one. There's a lot of, I think your reserves that you have now are really, really important. And now's a good time to, especially as we get out of this, to look at your policy on reserves to see if it's working for you. I think most cities over the past few years have been able to put up pretty good general fund reserves, and we're no exception to that. And that's really one area I'm looking at. In other words, rather than have a big drastic cut to anything right now, look at our reserve policy, see where it is now, and how much we feel comfortable going down in dipping into those reserves. Of course, reserves depend a lot about what kind of sales tax mix you have, I think, right? So Juliet was talking about certain types of cities and industries that are going to be hit much harder than others. And having reserves lets you be a little more flexible and have some just ability to deal with things that you wouldn't otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hill, how's the discussions going to go with your council and with staff and with your citizens as you prepare this budget and get ready to pass it this year?
Well, like many, we started our budget process months ago, and department budgets were done really before this COVID situation happened to us. And so we've been changing on the fly. As we've talked about it as a council, and as I've talked about it with many of my peers, the big thing that we're all facing, which is no surprise, is that we just don't know how long or how deep of an impact this is going to have. And so the key is kind of flexibility in my mind, that we have the ability, as we're setting up our budgets this year, to be able to react as economic conditions change. And there's, a couple of ways you can do that. One is you budget very conservatively and then plan for ways to, increase your expenditures if conditions improve, along the lines that Dean was suggesting with personnel. I'm aware of cities that are, for example, not budgeting any kind of a pay increase, merit or otherwise, to employees, but are leaving that option open for later. A second option is to, budget moderately and then have a plan for reducing expenditures as the conditions dictate. In our case, what we are likely going to do after we, I think, end up with a pretty conservative budget is departments are right now preparing 5 and then 10% reductions that we can take if the economy continues to stagnate or get problematic. So essentially, we get to a certain level in the economy, we push a button and we implement those 5% reductions and then 10% reductions. There's two things that are necessary to be able to do that. The first is identifying what your most important services are. It's unlikely we're going to do any kind of across the board reduction, something that would really impact levels of service that residents notice or that would cost us money later. Delaying necessary infrastructure improvements now, for example, and Quinn may be talking about this in a minute, might not be the best strategy. But the other thing that's really important is, if you're going to take that kind of approach, is that you plan to do your reduction or some of your purchases and projects later in the year. Vehicles, for example, that you might normally buy at the beginning of the year. Well, we're going to be putting those off to the end of the fiscal year so that we have the ability to cut those out if we need to, and a variety of other things like that. John, with regards to the community, that part of your question, I think it's important, in my opinion, to recognize that a lot of us are big parts of our local economies. We spend a lot of money. We do a lot of projects. We have the ability to impact what happens around us, who's hiring, and what kind of jobs are available. And so I think about all of this a little bit like the warning we all got in driver's ed years ago, that underinflating your tire is as dangerous as overinflating your tire. And I think that if we are too cautious, we can put our own economies as well as our own organizations in harm's way by not being able to recover quickly enough, just as much as if we are spending money perhaps that we don't know we're going to see in revenues.
Okay, thank you. And as we prepared to this, we kind of jokingly said that no matter what we budget, it's going to be wrong, and we're either going to be too high, too low. We really, we don't know. But budget amendment process. I think years ago we used to do that once a year. Recently we've done that more often, but I think it's something you can do now as often as you need to, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great tool that we have. What we're looking at really, I think for many of us, is we have the ability to react as conditions change. Flexibility is going to be our greatest benefit as cities right now. Give ourselves the ability to adjust up or down as we go along. And I think it's 10 days notice to be able to, with a public hearing, to be able to amend the budget if that's necessary. So that's one way we could do it.
So maybe a good strategy would be pass your budget and then plan on amending it as you get more information. So, and set up your spending so you can do some later on. Yeah. Quinn, I don't see you here. Are you online here?
I am.
There he is. Hey, Quinn, how you doing? So tell us some of the things maybe from a little more rural, vernal perspective. Some of your thoughts about how to deal with this.
Yeah, as we're going through the budget process as well, thinking about how we can best approach our upcoming budget year. We actually feel like we have kind of a double hit with the COVID situation and the economic impact there, but also the radical drop in the oil price per barrel has really impacted us. And I'm guessing it's very similar to the eastern and southern communities that have the tourism impact. So a couple strategies, and I reflect back to 2009, 2010, when we had significant budget impacts then. What did we do? I wasn't at Vernal at the time, but certainly the city I work for had major budget anxieties. And one of the things that we're going to look at, and with Vernal, we listed about 90 plus strategies to reduce the budget. And that did a couple things. One, it let everybody know, from council to staff to department heads and residents, if they were wanting to pay attention, what were we looking at? And some of those were, items you don't usually talk about, and at least put it out on the table so we were able to decide what was the most important of the priorities. We're going to be looking at that. Another item that I was able to do 10 years ago, take advantage of some things that are out in the economy. So at that time, you had low costs of borrowing, you had low costs of construction. And so we bonded $9 million for street projects and received a really good value of that. Now we were in a position where we could bond that and make sense of it within our future budget, or what we thought would be. I want to add to Gary's comments about us as employers and our entities being part of our local economies. And I think that's strong in our rural economies as well. You have a school district that's our #1 employer, then the county, and then cities are in there as well. And if we take a really deep cut, that really will impact our local economy. So we need to balance that as we're talking about our budget and what our expenditures are coming up. Those are my thoughts for now.
Okay, well, you explained to me the other day a little bit about CIB bonds, Community Impact Board bonds, and they seem to be more aimed at rural Utah. Can you talk about that for a minute? Yeah, certainly. I listened to the CIB board's meeting, was it about a week and a half ago, and those of you or those of us with CIB bonds, loans out, they are open to the idea of deferring that payment for a year. So it would, in essence, no payment in 2021 budget, and then extend your payment to the end of your normal loan. So those rural communities with CIB loans, that is a good strategy, and we will definitely be looking at that. Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, Cameron, do you have something you want to add here? You just came up on the screen.
I did. I've been answering questions in the chat box, but Mayor Dandoy, Roy had a question just about what cities were doing around, let me pull it back up here. He was talking about potential hiring freezes, but holding off new hiring of non-critical positions. So I was curious if any of the panelists wanted to address that issue.
Gary, would you tackle that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a legitimate strategy. We've taken the position here that adding personnel is going to be really hard right now unless there's any offsetting kind of revenue, and that really only coming from our utility fees. We don't expect to see a large decrease in some of our enterprise funds, for example. People still have to buy power. People still have to buy water. We don't expect now a significant impact there, but certainly delaying new hires and a tried and true strategy from the recession of 2008 was not filling vacant positions, if you can get away with that when they come up. Those are all legitimate strategies. I think we do need to be cautious, though, too, about keeping an eye on recovery, which is, what's going to happen when we come out of this? Will there be hiring being done that's going to, lure our trained professionals away from us? So we can't neglect our employees either. Again, I think what I would urge everyone is just to be very measured in dramatic changes of cutting staff or programs. We'll have time to react, I believe, but not filling vacant positions is a pretty safe strategy to begin with.
Okay, and Dean, you mentioned something about that your part of your strategy was to maybe, even if you had new hires in mind, that maybe you defer that for a few months. Is that what you said a little while ago? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, I think just where we've approached it, Gary kind of mentioned when we started this budget process, it was a pretty normal world, right? And so we kind of proceeded that way. We put a budget together as it stands now. And again, it's just a tentative budget and hasn't really gone through council yet. That's a pretty standard budget. And we do have a few new hires. We have, like I said, in this tentative status, we have it. It has a pay increase. And we're going to talk about that a lot over the next few weeks to see if and when those get implemented. But again, we have a few general fund positions, and it just comes down to, we would prioritize those and say, hey, there's certain positions that we'd hire before other positions. And if as the data comes in more and more, that's something we could delay hiring those until later in the year, if that would help save us money, or at least buy us a little time till we had better data to go on.
Okay.
And I think I mentioned too, just the idea that, no one knows how long this is going to last, and that's a difficult thing, but you can hurt yourself by being a little too conservative too. I think just the idea that, if you lay off people and do things like that, and things bounce back in 2 or 3 months, now you kind of put yourself in a situation where you have to refill those positions with people who maybe aren't as experienced, and now you're going to have to train them. So.
Okay, thank you. Quinn, a minute ago, you mentioned, that we also have a role as cities in being part of the recovery, and maybe not putting all your capital projects off, things like that. So would you recommend if we maybe look at some of our money that is set aside for a certain thing, like your utilities, and that are going to be relatively healthy? Those are the kind of capital projects we do, and maybe some of the general fund capital projects we hold back on. How would you suggest we balance that?
Yeah, so of course, each community is going to be different. I would be looking at capital projects that you're going to be doing in the next, 2, 3, 4 years, and look at borrowing costs that might be low.
Okay.
Maybe a really nice opportunity that your construction costs are low. I know that was the case 10 years ago, and it worked out really well for the community I worked with then. But of course, you need to make sense with it. If you're already heavily leveraged, that's maybe not the smartest move there.
Okay, and one last question from that I just saw punch up about. I don't really understand the difference between furloughs and layoffs. Is furloughs when you just let people go and say, we're going to keep your job open for when we can afford you? Is that, anybody talked about that?
I remember some communities 10 years ago that, like, you would be required to take 4 hours a week off or something like that. So
unpaid. Yeah.
Unpaid. Yeah. You're basically going to get a unpaid vacation, 4 hours a week. Yeah.
Okay. I get it. Okay. Well, I think our time is up. I have 5:01 and we promised an hour. Our intent is probably to hold something like this every week. And I think that'll be important because we'll get an idea by next week where we're going with some of our legislation that affects budgets, and then I think we'll have a lot more information probably in a couple of weeks. Cameron, do you want to wrap up and add anything to that?
Thank you. We do want to try to start a weekly town hall here with information to help you implement your policies in this new era. So to date, all of our town halls, oh, that's a very cute dog. All of our town halls have been focused on being a conduit for communication. What we're trying to do here is give you the tools and resources you need as you're going through your budgets and also implementing the new laws that may be coming in the weeks to come. We're expecting special sessions every 2 to 4 weeks for the next few months. So stay tuned for that. Most importantly, thank you for your participation in the league, and thank you for your leadership in your communities during this unprecedented and tumultuous time. So thank you for taking the time this afternoon.
And we'd like to thank Juliet.
And watch for the nightly email tonight with more information.
Okay. And we, of course, like to thank our panel and Cameron and Juliet for participating, and thank you. We'll see you.